We're all ready to get started. My name is Cajacob. I'm the Genealogy and Local History Librarian at Algonquin Public Library. This is our fourth genealogy Zoom chat, and I'm so excited. I'm just so excited every week to see. Every week we've got more and more people. I'm so excited to learn from all of you, and thrilled to see all of your wonderful human faces during this time of isolation. And so now I'll turn it over to Tina so she can introduce herself as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tara. I am Tina Beaird. I am the Genealogy and Local History Librarian at the Plainfield Public Library. I have been there what will be 17 years this September. So I'm doing it a long time. I love what I do. I'm lucky I get paid to do something that I love every day. So like many of us, I see a lot of familiar names in here who are their own libraries, local history and genealogy librarians.
Awesome. Yeah. Which is super fun because they can help us when we get stumped. So thank you for being here, all the librarians. So today we're going to talk about busting through brick walls with your genealogy research. And I think the challenging part of this topic is that every single brick wall is different, and that's why it's a brick wall. They've all got their unique challenges. And so it's hard to talk about them generically, but we're going to try our best. And so for anybody who hasn't heard the term brick wall, it's just kind of a term that we use to talk about a problem that we have a tough time solving when we run into, an ancestor that we can't find very much information on. Maybe they pop up in one census record, but we can't seem to fill in details from any other census records, or if we're stuck trying to find immigration records, or we can't get back further another generation. Those are kind of all examples of brick wall ancestors, and they can be very frustrating. So I'm curious, Tina, do you have any like generic kind of basic strategies that you use when you run up against a brick wall?
It depends on the topic, it depends on the country, and it depends on the date. I always give you a multi-part answer, don't I, Tara? It's one of those things where I consider a brick wall, and I have several of my own brick walls that I haven't been able to break through. And the way I look at a brick wall is it's a brick wall to me. It's not a brick wall to anybody else. And it might just be because I've exhausted my known resources. So that doesn't mean that there aren't other resources out there that can help solve the problem. Like I said, I've been at Plainfield for 17 years. I've been doing my research for over 25 years. But if somebody were to come to me and say, I'm looking for somebody in Plainfield, if I didn't find them in the first 3 resources that I always use, I might not think to look out of that box. We have a tendency to kind of, here's where my research is. Here are the 4 or 5 places I always go for information. That brick wall is a brick wall to me because I didn't realize there was a 6th option, or there was an alternative resource. So it kind of depends. I know that doesn't really answer the question, but it depends on the topic. So if I'm looking for that generation, trying to get back that extra generation, then I might try to look, you've looked within your ancestry, you've looked collaterally, so you've looked at aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that. But one thing that I would do in a situation like that is start looking at community resources, public history resources. So I might be stuck because I can't figure out who mom and dad are to George Middleton, but there might be other Middletons within that community. So I need to look at everybody. Okay, and if there aren't any Middletons, but I know my family comes from upstate New York, well, how many other people in that community come from upstate New York? So then I would start looking at those people. Even if I can't make a family connection, I might try to branch out and look publicly to see what's out there. If I'm looking for something a little more recent, something within the 20th century, I might turn to government resources. I might look at county clerk's records. I might look at property records. I might look at tax records. So it depends on the era, the location, and the brick wall.
Yeah, that's what's so tricky about this topic, really. I like it as a topic because I think, I don't know about you, but I get asked this question a lot in various forms. People just want to know where they're looking, where they should be looking that they aren't. And it's so specific. And like for me, I think as a really generic way of looking at it, and I assume it assumes that somebody else has found what you're looking for, but I think a lot of times they have, or they have a scrapbook that you didn't know existed, or they've talked to somebody, who passed away before you got a chance to. I think that this is a really good opportunity. I know we always caution people against using publicly published family trees, but I think this can be a really good time to do it when you're up against a brick wall, because if you look at their family trees, it can give you an idea of what else you can look for, what else might be out there, especially if they cite their sources well, which is a lesson, I think, for all of us to cite our sources well so that we can be helpful to others when they are facing brick walls. You can look and see, oh, look, there's a set of records that I've never looked at. Why don't I go see if I can hunt those down? Or, you might find that somebody has cited personal conversations with family members, or they may not have any citations. And in those cases, a lot of times, if I'm really stumped, I'll send an email. Family Search and Ancestry both give you options to email through their website, or you can look somebody up on Facebook.
Tara?
Yeah.
I actually had somebody with my DNA message me and say, hey, we're related, but I'd like to know how. And I looked through her tree and I found one name, and it happened to be a name that had been my brick wall for 30 years.
Wow.
And so we dug around, and I told her the name of it was a Schneider, and I told her the name of my Schneider, and she said, my Philip had a sister named Margaret. Hang on. She said, let me check. And she went back and she said, I have Bible records from the great-great-grandfather, and it lists a Margaret Schneider marrying a Jacob Deeby. And I said, that's my guy. But I still only had her word in the Bible records. But then Ancestry came out with with a will that had him, and he listed Margaret as his daughter and said that she had married a Deeby. So that was my additional proof. So that's
an amazing story. That's like a dream story, Linda. Wow.
30 years though, I had been hitting my head against the wall for Margaret, could not find any information, because you're talking Schneider in a German community in Ohio. Mm-hmm. How many are there?
Oh, I get it. I've got John Smith's.
Yeah. And,
I get it. Lynn, I'm glad you brought up DNA, because Tara and I talked a little bit about DNA for brick walls, but I've not done a DNA test, so I can't be the resource on that. So I'm glad you brought that up as somebody who has done it and has had it work for them. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Everybody should take one, because you never know what that, fifth cousin or that sixth cousin is going to have that could tie your trees together.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's such a cool story. I've got goosebumps. Maybe I just saw that email from Ancestry today saying that they've got their half off sale. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe today's the day. So thanks, Linda, for that. Yeah. So, I think that these situations are a great situation to kind of reach out to other genealogists and see what they have. And whether you're doing that through DNA or if you're kind of scouring Ancestry or Family Search for other people's trees, I think those can be really good opportunities. And another thing that I've used that's been useful, and it kind of is on par with what you were talking about, Tina, is plat maps, because that's another way that you can kind of look at the community around you and kind of look for those last names that overlap, especially because of the way land worked a lot of times, depending on when you're looking. Where people split their land between their children, and you can find related names, if a daughter married somebody with a different last name and they're real close together, and divided the land.
One thing I'd love to add about maps, and Linda, it says Linda NC, so I don't know if that's North Carolina or not, but I do a lot of research in South Carolina, and one of the things I love about the South is, from the Revolution to the Civil War, land rarely changes out of the family's hands. It just gets passed down. So looking at sales doesn't do you any good. The only way you're going to find it is by looking at probate records and looking how that land keeps getting subdivided and subdivided and subdivided. But on the regional maps, not just plat maps, so we're looking earlier than plat maps, but if you look at early land records, pre-revolution, revolutionary times, the land is listed by boundary, by neighbor. So I have dozens of maps where it's not, 40 acres, it's not 20 rods and 6 chains, it's you know, you're going in a straight line till you get to James Craig's farm, and then you're going, you know, north until you get to John McClure's farm, and it's actually giving me the names of all of the neighbors, which is a phenomenal resource. So if I have a brick wall and I know they lived in an area, they might not be listed in a property record as the buyer or seller, but they could show up in dozens of different records because they show up on those maps as being the boundary to their neighbors.
And if you lay that that plat map over a topographical map, and say you have two McClures and you don't know which one is yours, and you look at one is at the top of a hill and one is in the valley, and you're in the valley, you know that your McClure is probably the valley guy because you didn't get to the top of the hill.
No, and it's important to look at the topography because you wonder why, why is there a cluster of farms that's right here and there's nobody that's living north? Well, because they couldn't ford the river, or they couldn't get over the mountain, or they couldn't get around whatever the geographic obstacle was. Yeah. So that is a perfect example of why did everybody settle here instead of on that side? Because they couldn't get there.
Yeah, and if I could, I'd like to plug the IGHR, which is a week-long conference that's coming up in July. They actually have a map class where you're going to learn how to use Deed Mapper and Plat Maps, but they have 12 other courses. There's spots open, so, and it's virtual, so we'll be just like we are here in a classroom with an instructor. So if you'd like to go out and check, it's ighr.gagensociety.org, and I'll type it in the chat box.
Yeah, George's is good. GRIP is great. The one in Salt Lake is great. If you have the opportunity to take one of those in-depth week-long courses, they're amazing.
Yeah, so good. And I think anything where you can kind of get context is really helpful when you're running up against a brick wall, because it can always kind of redirect you. So like we talked about plat maps and like different, looking at different people's trees, but also I think it's a really good opportunity for newspaper research, especially because in those newspaper articles, sometimes you can find, well, for my grandparents, for example, their wedding was covered. They lived in a really tiny town. So my mother was like, it's like a royal wedding when she read it, because they talked about the color of the bridesmaids' dresses and all of the bridal party members. And so it really filled in kind of the context of like who were the important people in their life, even that weren't family members, who stood up for them, and what songs were played at their wedding, and all kinds of really neat things. And I think a lot of us know to use newspapers, but I also think sometimes when we're on a roll with one of the databases or doing, more traditional genealogy research, it kind of falls by the wayside. But those articles can really color in the lives of our ancestors in really cool ways, and create connections between different people in their communities. And tell us about cool things that they lived through too. I mean, you never know when we're long gone, there'll be all these stories about the pandemic, and who knows if our great grandchildren will have realized how much it affected our lives. So I
think newspapers are a great resource too, and I think a lot of times we overlook newspapers because we have a tendency to narrow ourselves by date. So John Smith lives from 1837 to 1900. If we stop our newspaper research at 1900, then you miss the opportunity of him getting mentioned after he's gone. So if he has a probate and he has young children, his probate wouldn't close until those children were of age. So he could still be showing up in newspaper accounts in probate columns in 1905, 1910, 1912, or his spouse might die after him. Or I think almost every one of our communities has a back when newspaper column where they're rerunning articles from 75 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, and they're listing those same people. So if you cut yourself off at their date of death, you miss that opportunity that, their graduating class photo might be used 50 years later for, the 50th anniversary homecoming float or something like that. You lose that opportunity. And one other thing about newspapers is that you have to realize you have to read the newspaper and really understand who's represented and who's not. I'll give Waterloo, Iowa as an example. Waterloo, Iowa had 6 community newspapers. And each one of those newspapers reported on a different part of town. It might have been the Irish or the German, or it might have been, another nationality. They might have focused on the north side of town versus the south side of town. They might have focused on Catholics versus Presbyterians and Protestants. So you have to read each newspaper to kind of get the cadence and the feel for who's being represented. And you have to cast a wider net. So I live in Oswego, I work in Plainfield. Plainfield is written up more in the Aurora newspaper than in Joliet newspaper right next door. So Joliet is the county seat. It writes about every township, every city in Will County. But their correspondent to Plainfield was terrible. But somebody from Plainfield had a cousin that lived in Aurora, even though it's 2 counties over and 20 miles away, they had a daily correspondent to somebody in Plainfield. So sometimes you have to cast that net wider, because just because the county seat might be closer, you need to go to the closest big city. So if that big city is in another county, you have to go outside of your county. And the farther back you go, the longer you have to give for news to arrive. So if you're looking at newspapers, I'll give South Carolina and North Carolina again as an example. You know, if you've got family up in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and the only newspaper in that era is in Charleston or is in Columbia, it could take 3, 4, 5, 6 months for that news to finally arrive. So you need to give yourself time and not rule things out because you think, oh, it wouldn't have taken 4 months for that obit to reach Charleston, South Carolina. Yeah, it could have, easily could have. So, you know, there's those 3 things you want to keep in mind when you're looking at newspapers specifically.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Linda said just a few minutes ago in the chat too, you know, start by casting a wide net and work into like a narrower, you know, work narrower, which is something I think we tell our patrons all the time. That is really, especially when you're struggling. I think there's this tendency to be like, I know her birth date, I know her date of death, I know exactly how to spell her first, middle, and last name. I know all these details, I'm going to put them all in. And I think as a general strategy for all genealogy, but especially when you're running into those brick walls, as broad as you can be, as much as you can, you know, get it as wide as you can, see everything that's out there, and then you can start, you know, playing with those search parameters and kind of narrowing in on it. And even like you were saying, you know, how it could be towns or states over, you can find this information. I think it's a big thing with the Chicago area, especially like where we draw the line of where Chicago ends. It's so subjective. I mean, it may be not for us, but like in other states too, if you're looking for something like an obituary, you know, the obituary might say that this person died in Chicago when they didn't, or, you know, it's always helpful to like look at the next big city over, or, you know, think about the way news moves and how we get our information and how that might be different or similar in other time periods you're researching too. It looks like we have a question. Shannon, did you see a question?
Yeah, so it looks like Sarah is saying, hello, I'm trying to find a birth record for my great-grandmother who, according to her marriage record, was born in 1892 in Joy Mercer County, Illinois. I've not been able to find a birth record for her in the Illinois state databases. Also, her mother is listed on the marriage record as a surviving parent. I assume that her father died before her wedding, but I can't find any records on him either. Where would you suggest I look next? And then says thank you.
You want to start, Tara?
Oof. Well, I guess it depends where you've searched so far. So you've searched in the Illinois state databases. So I assume you're looking at the vital statistics records, like the CyberDrive Illinois records. Is that right, Sarah? And if you're comfortable, you can turn on your microphone and talk with us.
Yeah, I did. I just unmuted.
Okay.
But it seems Joy is a very teeny tiny town, and I can find hardly anything on the town.
Okay.
So I'm wondering where I might be able to find newspapers that would have covered that town. They probably didn't have their own, being as small as they were.
Well, you'd be surprised at how many newspapers actually existed in small towns.
Well, true.
A couple of suggestions I would offer. Even though Illinois started recording births and deaths in November 1st of 1877, it was requested, not required, until 1914. So there's always the potential there that they just didn't record it for one reason or another. I would probably look, if she survived long enough to collect Social Security, I'd probably be looking for either a delayed or an amended birth certificate, and those in some counties aren't filed chronologically. Sometimes they're kept in separate books. Sometimes it's worth it to check with the clerk's office, not necessarily in the county, but in the town, to see if they had registered it as well. I'd probably go looking for church records to see if I could figure out if there's a baptism or some other kind of notice there.
Yeah, I've looked
But
in
the
the
Illinois
that I
Digital
could find.
Newspaper Project, I know Louise is on here because she said hi. Louise at the Joliet Library worked on the Illinois Newspaper Project, and they have a very comprehensive list of newspapers from across the state, some that are available online, but most are it's just an inventory of what exists and who has it.
Right.
So I would probably go looking at the Illinois Newspaper Project to see if a newspaper even existed in that town. If it didn't, again, I'd look at the county seat because they would typically run an article once a week about each town or community within. But then I would also be looking for the closest big town. So if they're closer to Springfield, or they're closer to St. Louis, or they're closer to Cairo, which had a ton of newspapers, I would be looking to see what is the biggest town and look at the dates that are available. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library also has an inventory on their website of newspapers. So if you just put in newspapers, Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, it'll take you to the list and it'll give you the dates. So you'll be able to see how long a particular paper was in business. And if they have it listed in theirs, then they have it in Springfield for you to go and take a look at. It's worth a try.
Would that be online in Springfield?
You can look at the list of newspapers that exist, and then I'd go poking around online. The problem is there's not one-stop shopping for newspapers any longer.
Right.
You've got Chronicling America, you've got Google News, you've got newspapers.com, Newspaper Archive. Newspaper Archive is actually really strong for downstate. So they have a lot of downstate Illinois newspapers, but it's by subscription. There's a wiki page on Google that'll give you all of the digitized newspaper collections that are out there. Typically, if I'm going to start looking, I would either go to Elefind first, or I'd go to The Ancestor Hunt, which I know Tara's talked about a couple times over the last couple of weeks.
What was the last one you mentioned?
It's called The Ancestor Hunt. You have to put the in, because if you put in just Ancestor Hunt, it's a completely different company. But Elefind, which I think was in the handout that Tara just sent out today with all the links we talked about, and the Ancestor Hunt would have a list. But then I'd go to see what libraries are in that county and check their local history pages and see what do they have. Do they have an obit index? Do they have a veterans index? Do they have cemetery burials? Do they have land records? I'd start looking to see all of the libraries, all of the historical societies. If there's a college, I'd be looking at the college's special collections page, because a lot of colleges, in the absence of a historical society, will collect local and public history. So they'll have maps, they'll have yearbooks, they'll have city directories, they'll have phone books, all of that kind of public history that's outside of just genealogy, a specific surname. So I'd be looking at the colleges, I'd be looking at the community college, anybody that might have something on the history of that county.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, all of that was awesome advice. The other thing is just a really quick search turned up the Rock Island Argus as a possible newspaper. It looks like Rock Island was only about 30 minutes away, so you might try that. I don't know if it'll have anything, but I put a link in the chat box for the Library of Congress page. They have it on Chronicling America, so
thank you.
Maybe worth a shot.
Thanks.
And the other thing that I think Tina's mentioned quite a few times in our past Zoom chats too is that it's always helpful to see if you can find a nearby historical society, or even check with the local library there. They'll have tons of information about, you know, what resources cover their town too. If you can't find it anywhere else.
Yeah, I was born in Illinois, but I only lived there a few months before my parents moved me away. So I don't know my way around Illinois at all. Okay, thank you very much.
I just checked on newspapers.com, and the Galesburg newspaper is available. And Galesburg's about 20 or 25 miles away from Joy.
And Galesburg has a fantastic historical society.
Yeah. I was going to say that, excuse me, I was going to say a lot of stuff is not online. So I found some obituaries for my family at the Geneva History Museum.
Mm-hmm.
In the which history museum?
Geneva History Museum.
They have an amazing collection and a great archivist. I'm a little biased.
Newspapers.com is offering free access to their publisher's edition through tomorrow at midnight Mountain Daylight Time. Normally you have to pay extra to get anything from the publisher's edition.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. That was a great question, Sarah. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you.
I also put in the chat box that Newspapers Archive is offering a free 30-day trial. The code is news. I just used it at the end of last week and it still worked. So I don't know if it's this month only, but it's 30 days. That's a good resource. That's one that you can get during the Try It Illinois time. But, that's usually when I pick it up, but it's a good one for a lot of other small towns too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Whenever I'm researching a new place, I try to always look at Family Search's wiki.
Right.
And I put over in the chat box that they said to look at, and I don't know geography either, Burlington, Iowa newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, they got married in Burlington.
Well, you might find articles and stuff about them there.
Yeah, it's just right across the river from Rock Island.
Good idea.
You can also try the Digital Public Library of America. It's dp.la, and they have a lot of free stuff out there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
IDA, Illinois, which is the Illinois Digital Archives, feeds into DPLA. So if any of us, like I have collections in IDA, it automatically uploads to DPLA. So sometimes you don't have to search both places.
Great, thanks. And I'm saving the chat. So it's so great you can do that. And then I don't have to badly take notes.
Yes, agreed. Awesome. Well, I'm kind of like, I'm excited about all the advice everybody gave because there were a lot of things in there that I wouldn't have even thought of. So I'm looking at our outline for this, and you mentioned additional non-genealogy sources, Tina. Are there any that you really like using for brick walls specifically?
Absolutely. We have a tendency to focus on going to genealogy sites and looking at genealogy resources. But there are a lot of history resources, business resources that you can take advantage of. If I can tilt my screen a little, I grab some of the books off my shelf, so things, you can't see it all that well, but I've got things like Architecture of the Old South. Architecture books will have, dozen-page bibliographies that are going to talk about, architectural styles, architects, all kinds of things, historic buildings that potentially could represent a community where you're doing your research, encyclopedias, like Encyclopedia of the 20th Century, Encyclopedia, History of France, whatever it happens to be. I've got a lot of books, like I've got Our Nation's Archives, which is a book that the National Archive put out of like the top 100 documents in U.S. history. So it includes things like the Homestead Act, so if you had families who homesteaded, that would be important to add to your genealogy. Books like Chicago Then and Now, DC Then and Now, which are going to show you historic blocks that you might be able to, say, oh, hey, that's where my family went or were married or went to school. And then those same resources could transport online, so things like Marquis's Who's Who. These are historical guides of who's who in America. So if I had a famous scientist in my family, I could go out to Marquis and put in that name and see what comes up. Things like Chicago Blue Books or Illinois Blue Books or something that's going to have lists of names. They're not genealogical resources, but they could really be beneficial. Like the Chicago Then and Now, there are sites like Shorpy, there are sites like Retronaut that have a lot of really good historic photos. Flickr is a really good example of someplace where you can go to get historic images from places like the National Archives, the National Library of Ireland, the National Archives of Scotland, Australia, that are global, that are going to give you that good historical perspective. Things like What Was There or History Pin are going to offer great resources, and they're outside of that genealogical focus, but they're really, really still useful to genealogists. So, if you can't find it online, they might exist in person somewhere. So I'm a huge fan of Archive Grid. I don't know how many of you have ever used Archive Grid before, or OCLC WorldCat, which is a world catalog for books. But Archive Grid is for archival manuscript collections. So those individual family papers, things like, I went to ISU, that's where I got both of my bachelor's degrees. And they have the Circus and Allied Arts collection. So if you had somebody who worked for Ringling Brothers, or somebody who was in vaudeville, then the potential is there that you would find their names listed in Archive Grid. And there aren't records online for Archive Grid, but they tell you who has it. So I might find my family listed in a collection, that's in Wisconsin, even though my family's never lived in Wisconsin, because they're represented in a collection about a particular topic, a railroad collection, a circus collection, a women's studies collection, whatever it happens to be. And a lot of universities and colleges are overlooked by genealogists as a resource. But like, I used to work at the University of Chicago in special collections. So I could go up to the 3rd floor, and not only could I go through the newspaper collections, but their business collections. So they would have, ledgers of Chicago businesses and of Hyde Park businesses. So it's not just libraries in historical societies that have that genealogical business information. If you had a family member who owned a particular business, a lot of colleges and libraries collect those types of things too. Like in the Carolinas, can't remember if it's NC State or which college it is, but they have in their special collections, they have a collection of advertisements and marketing. So like my grandmother, God rest her soul, my grandma Nellie, who I miss terribly every day, had some very clever euphemisms that she used to use all the time, and most of them are inappropriate and I can't repeat them in public. But one of them that she used to use all the time was, "You've got more excuses than Carter's got pills." And if any of you have ever heard that statement before, I'm going to applaud you, because I grew up on the South Side, which is where they used to make the Carter's Little Liver Pills. It's a tongue twister. But the university I was just speaking of had a huge collection of Carter's advertising for their liver pills. So I was able to use some of that advertising to tell that story. So sometimes you really need to broaden out. Like my grandpa worked for Campbell's Soup, for 25 years. Look for those company newsletters. Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, you guys know me, I'm going to sing the song. But on Internet Archive, if you go out to archive.org, the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe company newsletters are digitized and available on there for free. So business resources can be a huge resource for you if it's one that you haven't used before.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome, Tina. Like, I think that's what I have to say to that. And it's true though, because like when you start finding that stuff, it like can open a whole new research path for you. When you start to find like, okay, this person owned a business, and the dominoes kind of start to fall, and you start to find this new path, and that's how these brick walls really come down. And Shannon, I think we have another question, right?
Yes. Oh. Am I unmuted? Okay, good. Yes. Yes, we do have another question. So this is from David. He said that I have a similar question to Sarah. I'm looking for the birth record for a son, Albert, of my great-great-grandfather, Joseph. Albert is listed with his family on the 1880 census in South Dakota at age 5, and he is listed as being born in Illinois. He was born in either 1874 or 1875. Joseph is listed as living in Chicago from 1872 through 1878 based on his listings in the Chicago City directories. And then Albert's younger sister, Minnie, was born in Chicago in 1873, and she is listed in the Cook County, Illinois birth certificates index. The problem is that Albert is not listed in the same Cook County index, and I know that the final Illinois state census was in 1865. Any suggestions where to look for Albert's birthday or registration? And then he did have another comment where he said, I have searched newspapers extensively.
Mm-hmm. That's not surprising. Illinois didn't start recording births and deaths until 1877, so it's not unusual that you're not going to find him there. What I would be looking for is if he is living in South Dakota and lives long enough to be eligible for Social Security, One, I'd be applying for his social security card. I'd be getting the SS5.
He died in 1881.
1881?
Yes.
Okay.
At the age of 5.
Were they Catholic?
Nope.
Were they Jewish or Presbyterian?
Nope.
What were they?
Nothing that I'd be able to track down.
Okay.
The father was a butcher, worked with his 2 brothers that were purveyors in Chicago. They were there from 1860s, well past. Then they moved to Deadwood as a family, and 3 of the kids died in 1881 of diphtheria epidemic. So
would he have been old enough to be in school?
No.
He would have died before then. Because South Dakota, a lot of South Dakota school records are online.
Yeah,
so the potential would have been there that you could find those in family search with the age. It wouldn't have the date of birth, it would have the age. Do you have the probates for mom and dad?
Just for dad, but it doesn't have anything listed for him at all.
Because a lot of times they would have to say there'd be a proof of heirship page in that probate that would list all the children, even if they died, to say there are no heirs that are, able to inherit this estate.
No, he died a good 22 years or so before the father did, so he's not even listed. I'm truly at a brick wall with this one kid.
And Illinois didn't do a census in 1875, so there's no resource there.
Yeah, they stopped in 65.
Chicago had so many newspapers. Where did they live in the city?
Directories that I had was Milwaukee Avenue for 1875, and then looks like West Hoffman Avenue near Milwaukee Avenue for the 77, 78 directories.
So they're on the north side.
Do you know what ethnicity were they, David?
They were English.
English, okay.
I mean, you're not far from places like Buffalo Grove, Niles, which do have newspaper collections. I think Niles' collection might go back that far. You check the Interocean and you didn't have anything?
No.
Chicago Daily News, which should have started, I think, in might have been 1870.
Yeah, I have searched everything.
1871.
I've searched everything I can on newspapers.com.
There aren't many Chicago newspapers that are actually online, so sometimes you have to go
the Tribune,
to either.
I've gone through the Tribune, Interocean.
Tribune wouldn't be. I would never look anything up in the Tribune in that time period.
I actually found quite a bit of the brothers in there.
The business.
Yeah, the business side of things.
Because Tribune just wasn't good for societal stuff, births, marriages, and deaths, unless you were incredibly wealthy. But yeah, there were dozens of newspapers in Chicago, and a lot of those, they're on microfilm and they're accessible through places like the Newberry Chicago History Museum. The
problem is I'm in South Dakota.
Well, you have all of us here at your disposal, David.
I know, that's why I took a jump at this. So I'll see if I can.
I'm sure there's one of us close enough to one of those institutions to go and get copies for you. It still wouldn't hurt to take a look at take a look and see what Anglican churches were in the area. Take a look and see what predominantly would have been, if they were English, what Protestant churches were around, just to kind of cold call and say, hey, is it possible that you might have some kind of entry for them? Garrett Theological Seminary might be a place where I would look for those at Northwestern.
So the only thing I could possibly tie religion-wise would be Baptist.
Okay.
And only because Joseph's father was a Baptist in England, but I have no evidence of the family bringing that over with them or attending anything Baptist here in the States.
Well, maybe we've got a copy of your question, David. So maybe if you want to message, if you can direct chat me your email address.
Okay, we'll do.
I've got time. I'll see what I can putz around with and find for you. Because I've got nothing. I'm really impressed that Tina came up with so many ideas. And that, unfortunately, with brick walls is a little bit of my problem, is that it's just sometimes it's just putzing. trying to spell things in different ways, playing with the dates, seeing what you can come up with. Just sometimes it's luck of the draw.
All right, I appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll see what we can come up with for you. I'm sorry we didn't have anything.
That's all right.
I would probably go and look at the city directory for 1874, 75, and look and see what Baptist churches existed. You know, even if you can't prove that they were still following that, baptisms were kind of an important thing, and they might have still done it, even though they might not have attended church on a regular basis. So, I mean, I guess if you're going to throw a Hail Mary, I mean, I guess that would be one that I would throw.
Okay.
And you don't want to look at Baptist churches now. It's not going to do any good. You need to be looking at the ones that are in the city directory for that time period and even see if they still exist.
Okay. I appreciate it.
Yeah, wow. Some of those are really tricky, especially, I mean, it sounds like he was really young when he died, and with the timing, hopefully we can find something for you. Otherwise, fingers crossed. So
David, let me ask David one more question. So you said he died during the diphtheria outbreak, yes?
Yes, in 1881.
In South Dakota?
Yes, in Deadwood.
So South Dakota wouldn't have had death records at that time, but usually coroner's records precede death records. Like in Illinois, coroner's records go all the way back to the 1840s in some communities, even though deaths aren't recorded until 1877. Anything that's unnatural causes like that potentially could have been picked up in a coroner's inquest, and in the coroner's inquest potentially could have had his date of birth in it. I mean, it's a long shot, but that's what we're doing now, is long shots.
Yeah, but we're dealing with Deadwood, which was established in 1876. So they do have a death record for all three of the kids, and I have the doctor's names and everything that attended to them. But beyond that, there is no other record because Deadwood was so Deadwood that it's schools were not fully established in the area to where there were records and so on. And South Dakota school records or registrations didn't start much later. So,
but usually the death certificate is derived from the death register. So I'd be curious to know if there's, other, and coroners kept their own books. So, did the coroner make a note, or did the doctor keep a journal about the horrors of what was going on at that time? And that could have been published somewhere in JSTOR, somebody in that historical society did, a paper on, what life was like during the diphtheria outbreak, and somebody might mention these kids or this family in some kind of tangential way.
Or Nancy mentioned the state archives, or that would be a really good one that university archives might be interested in collecting those kinds of records too. And
I'd be looking for the doctor.
If you can get on Archive Grid and search that way, that would be a really good way to kind of just see where there would be those kinds of records.
Okay.
Get on the phone and the other thing is, when an institution collects those kinds of records, especially if it's a university or a bigger institution, they typically know who else is collecting them too. So if they don't have them, they can direct you to another institution that might.
Yeah, I've run down the historian who's doing a lot of Deadwood work, and I've actually met him at the state archive, and we're still kind of strings. So, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, Tara. We're not moving off of this. I'm sorry. The Associated Press has been around since 1855. So on a slow news day, things get picked up by the AP and get run all across the country. Like in Plainfield, we had a young lady who committed suicide. She was a jilted lover. Her boyfriend dumped her. She drowned herself. And in teeny tiny little Plainfield, this girl commits suicide, and it got picked up by the AP in 1907 and run in Oklahoma and in Michigan and in Washington State and in Georgia. So, I mean, an outbreak like that, potentially, I wouldn't search for the children by name, but I would search to see if anybody mentions the town during that period outside of Deadwood, to see if maybe it got picked up by the Associated Press and somebody ran it because it was a slow news day. Oh, this poor family lost all these kids. There might be some other kind of tangential. It won't be a birth date, but it'd be something.
Okay, thank you.
And Shannon, you said we had another question?
Yeah, so we actually have 3 now.
Okay.
So the first one was Laura. She said my paternal great-grandfather was born in Cole County, and that she's looking for his biological father.
What's our time period?
He was born in 1881 or 1882.
Okay.
Where have you tried looking?
I've looked for birth records in Illinois, and there's nothing there. I have a copy of his death certificate that just lists a last name, but he was given that last name when his mother married, when he was 7 years old. So that wasn't, and I find him in the 1885 Nebraska census with his mother, her parents, and his mother's siblings. And he's listed as a 3-year-old son there.
So he had her name up until she married when he was 7? Is that what I'm understanding?
According to the census record, yes. And he was actually listed in the census as a son of her parents, which biologically, I don't know that that would be possible. They were quite a bit older, but I suppose it could be. But I have a little notebook that belonged to his mother, which said that he was her firstborn. I mean, she has listed his name, and then years later when she married has listed the other 4 children that she gave birth to.
What denomination were they?
Please
tell me Presbyterian.
No.
If they were Presbyterian, then if she had a child out of wedlock, she would have had to have gone before the session, and she would have had to have named who the father was.
Oh, is that right?
Catholics would make you do that sometimes, but not anywhere near as forcefully as Presbyterians would have. So, I mean, that could have been like, there you go, there's your answer. If they went through the actual process of adoption, then in the county where she married and where her and her husband were living when they changed his name,
okay.
A lot of times if you look under chancery records,
okay,
under P for paternus, they're not trying to hide anything, that's just they use the Latin term. A lot of times you'll find adoptions listed in there, and they might, depending on the state, they might keep you from looking at the original document, but they can't keep you from the index because everything's in the index. So in a chancery court, you would have land disputes, you'd have estate divisions. They can't keep you from the index. So I would look under his given name that he adopts, and I would look under P to see if he might be listed under that. And believe it or not, if it was an official adoption, a lot of times they ran those ads in the local newspaper in the court column. And they ran those in the paper all the way up into the 1960s in Illinois. In Nebraska, I mean, I have family in Nebraska too. You could find them in the 30s and in the 40s. So I have some that go all the way back to the 1860s, where it's just one line that has, the name of the birth parents and the name of the adoptive parents. And if anybody objects, you've got until this date to come to the courthouse. And
his mother was married in Colorado. So they're travelers.
They are, but Colorado newspapers are digitized online through the Colorado Newspaper Project. So it's worth doing a search on the name to see if anything pops up.
All right, I haven't tried that. I'll try that. Thank you.
Did you try ordering copies of marriage licenses or birth certificates from the county website by any chance?
Well, I have a copy of the marriage license because they ended up getting married where I live in Kansas. That's where he and my great grandma met.
Okay.
And then they split. But no, there's nothing on there.
Okay. All right. I just pulled up the Cole County Clerk Vital Records and saw that they do have a genealogy section. So that might be something.
They were there maybe 2 years or something after he was born. Maybe. I don't know. So they were only in Cole County a limited period of time.
Well, I mean, you've got, remember what I was just saying, the birth certificate is derived from the birth register. So you could check family search if you go into the catalog to see if the registers were indexed for Cole County, to see, and if your library is an affiliate library, you can visit that library and get access to those digitized records if they've been digitized. The birth registers in the 1870s and 1880s had different information on them than the birth certificate. The birth register would have the name and the place of birth of both parents, whereas the certificate didn't. So the potential is there that it could have been on the register and just didn't get transferred to the certificate. If a child was born by a doula, that would be listed on the register, but only the doctor could sign the birth certificate. So the information isn't always the same. And the register has a lot more on it than the certificate does. Because Illinois went through 3 different birth certificate formats between 1877 and 1900.
Wow.
So on the really early ones, there's not a whole lot of information. Same thing with deaths. There's not a whole lot of information. The register has more.
Okay, we are running a little bit short on time, so let's go on to one of the next questions. Shannon, you said that there were a few more?
Yeah, so just 2 more. So this is from Nancy. She says, Tina, you come highly recommended from Nancy at the Lake Zurich ELA Library. And Dad, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy. She's down there. I can see her on my screen.
Nancy's researching having a brick wall for her great-grandfather. She just discovered you and bam, COVID. So interested in the Will County record research. And then she did say that I have a first name of an ancestor female, but can't seem to find her last name anywhere. In Pennsylvania, where or there are some places I could look, born between 1809 and then married 1882 and died 1882. Her married name was Hayden, and believe she was born in Hayton, most likely at home. Hoping to locate info on the birth.
I think,
was that Hayden with an H?
No, that wasn't all of my message. So
sorry. I think I must have asking me questions.
That's okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so you were asking about the great-grandfather.
Yes.
That's the Will County one?
Will County, born in 1879 in Peatone.
Okay.
Barclay and Armstrong are his referenced parental names on the death certificate. I went to the actual cemetery to find the records, and there is nothing, even though they say I went to Mantino where I suppose that he was buried, and there's no headstones, there's no information with the archive, and nothing. So, but the whole story was in 1913 that he was actually on a some sort of fishing expedition off of Navy Pier, and he drowned. And there was remains of him found as far as his coat, his hat, his bag. So there's speculation about what exactly happened. And I did actually found the newspaper article on it. But interestingly enough, there's still a lot of mystery, as my grandmother, which would be her father, has passed, but did not want to speak of it. And there's always been that inclination that perhaps he just took off and went somewhere. So I was instructed from Nancy, who is, as I said, you keep highly recommended to research the possibility of finding any kind of birth record of him. And I would imagine he was born at home in Peatone to the Armstrong Barclay family in Peatone. And there was only one family, as far as I could tell, in Peatone at that time.
Yes. So with a name like Barclay and Armstrong, I'm assuming they're Scots. They're
Yes.
Scottish. So
because you can't tell that I am, right?
So yes, the wheels are turning in my head. Nancy, send me a message directly in the chat with your email address.
Will do.
I can do a little bit of research from home, but until I can get into my collection at the library, all I can do is give you suggestions, but I can't do any digging until we go back to work.
Thank you.
So, but yes, absolutely. I have a couple of ideas. So
okay,
send me a message.
Thank you.
Okay. And what's our third question, Shannon?
Okay, and this one I promise I won't mess up. Well, at least I
So
hope.
hard. That chat gets me every week. Thank God for you.
I thought I was doing so well, but no. Okay, so this is Linda from I have a first name of an ancestor female, but can't seem to find her last name anywhere. Where are some places I could look? Born 1809, married 1882, died 1882, and her married name was Hayden. First name Persena.
So she's born in 1809, dies in 1882.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
And she's in Pennsylvania. I'd probably go to the DAR website first and see if she's listed in somebody's tree. So I'd go to dar.org. That is the number one place where I will go to first when I'm looking for a woman born before 1850, before she shows up in the first every name index. I always use the DAR first, because even though they might not have had a direct ancestor who was a revolutionary, they easily could pop up in other people's research and show up in that database. So when I'm looking for people between 1790 and 1850, that's where I start.
Okay, I'll definitely do that, because she was, that line does go back to the Revolutionary War, but everywhere I see her name, all I see is Hayden. So it's either her maiden name was Hayden and she married a Hayden, or she was some way from somewhere that didn't have a last name.
Pennsylvania State Historical Society has some fantastic records that are available online. Like their land records all the way back to pre-revolution are available online. So if you know the county, you can kind of poke around to see if a name sounds familiar to you, to see. Depending on what their denomination was, you could check to see what types of church records exist. I know there were a couple of circuit riders in Pennsylvania between like Washington County outside of Pittsburgh and Gettysburg. There were a couple of circuit riders who kept journals, and those have been digitized and are available. And I think those might go up to 1830 to see if their name might pop up in one of those. But there's Pennsylvania has a lot of really good old historic records online. Plus I would probably go into Internet Archive and I would poke around to see what types of records are digitized online through Internet Archive. So besides looking for county histories, there's a lot of regional histories. So like if you're in Pennsylvania, instead of searching by specific county, especially for 1809, I'd be looking for things like the Juniata Valley, which is much larger than just one individual county. And a lot of histories are organized, early history, especially in the Carolinas, that are done by the creek, Durbin Creek, Rocking Creek, whatever it happens to be, and not by county. So I would be looking at like early reminiscences, state histories, regional histories, just to kind of get a feel for if you recognize a surname or something like that. And a lot of times as people traveled south, because this happened with my Scots, they started in Pennsylvania, moved down to Cowpens, Virginia, right before the war. Then by the time of the Revolution, they've moved into Mecklenburg County. And then after the Revolution, they're in Chester County, South Carolina. So there are a lot of chain migrations that follow that path. So I would be looking for histories of those chain migrations to see if you recognize any of those surnames.
Okay, yeah, because this is Allegheny and Westmoreland counties.
Mm-hmm.
And then they left there and went to Indiana for a couple of years. And then they went down to Ohio and Iowa.
Okay. So they're following the Ohio River.
Yeah.
They're kind of going this way. Okay. And she dies in 1802 or 1882 in what state?
In Ohio, I believe.
Okay.
And there's no mention of her maiden name. I've looked at the children's birth records of those that I could find. There's no mention of a maiden name. Her marriage record is non-existent, so there's no mention of a married name or a maiden name. So this is my new brick wall.
But it sounds like they definitely made that chain migration west. It got too crowded, so we moved here. It got too crowded, we moved there. So it sounds like they're following that pattern. So I would trace it backwards, because like a county history of where she dies in Ohio, you know, so if you look at one of those county histories from 1880 for that community, they'll kind of tell you where those people came from. So I would see if there's any connection there, you know, and they'll kind of tell you, you know, they came to Ohio, but they were starting from Westmoreland, and I'd be looking for, I'd take all of those names, because like Will County did that for Plainfield. So in the 1876 county history, it says Plainfield was founded by these families that came from these counties. And I would just look up every single name that says that it came from that county. Or I would do a search on Westmoreland and see every person who comes up in that county history from that county and check every one of those names.
And I just got a private message from somebody asking me, did she marry George Hayden? And I was like, yes, that's the one. So, somebody has my information.
Hey, that's fantastic. But yeah, I would probably start with DAR and just look to see if her name pops up anywhere. Because you'll show up in the chain. You don't have to be the person who applied or the patriot. There's a lot of people who show up in between. And it's $10 to buy a copy of the paperwork if it looks good.
Yeah.
So it's fairly cheap.
Okay, guys, with that, I think we're going to wrap up. We've run a little long tonight because of all of your fabulous questions. Thank God for Tina. You did a wonderful job fielding these questions. I don't know if I would have been able to do so well.
Sorry.
So, did you just apologize for answering the question?
Yes.
No!
I want to cut you off.
Oh my God, no. I'm so grateful for you. Every time you come, it's like such a wonderful learning experience, and thank you. So just to kind of go over what we've got coming up, we just posted the events for May. So we're going to continue this genealogy Zoom chat session into May. You all have been wonderful and coming, and we want to keep it going as long as we can. So next week's session, we're going to be talking about using Ancestry Library Edition. Ancestry announced that they're going to be extending their availability for using it from home through the end of May. So we thought we would take advantage of that and talk about different strategies that we use when we're searching Ancestry. So we hope you can come next week, May 6th at 6 o'clock. You can register on Eventbrite. Many of the libraries who are participating are doing registration through their websites as well. However you do it, we just hope you'll come. And it'll be every Wednesday at 6 o'clock. You can see it all on that Eventbrite page for the rest of May at least. So here's hoping that the pandemic ends, and as much as we love doing this and love seeing all of you, that there won't be another extension. So have a wonderful week, and thanks again. Thanks everybody for all of your wonderful questions and your advice and for coming tonight.
Thanks everybody. Thanks, Tara.
Thanks, ladies.
Bye, guys.
Bye.